Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. We are about to have first dog on the moon, following the Outsiders. That's if he's going to be on. Don't know. I got up late today. Went to Stockwood last night. I'll upload footage of Stockwood after I've uploaded the Outsiders and first dog on the moon.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy and you're not. And chomping on their cigars this morning for our pre-budget Outsiders session, a professor of institutional economics at RMIT University, Sinclair Davidson, impeccably Windsor-knotted this morning, Sinclair.
Thank you very much. Couldn't let you down.
National Affairs Correspondent at New Matilda, Research Fellow at Deakin University, Ben Eltham, and James Patterson, Editor of the IPA Review. Welcome to you all.
Good morning.
Morning. Budget. Has there been, in this extraordinarily well-managed season of budget expectation management, a more unfortunate image than that of the Finance Minister and the Treasurer chomping on their stogies late last week?
It's just not a good look at all, actually, to be celebrating in the midst of budget cuts and broken promises. It's quite shocking, actually. I think the spin on it and management of a process like that, you'd expect him to be looking sad and mournful, not at all celebratory.
When the rest of the process has been so impeccably spun and managed, I can't remember a budget in recent recall where not only have we had the usual trail of leaks, but the whole setup of the situation, of the problem, of why we're doing this has been so elaborate.
I think it's been a confused mess, basically. I mean, I think the government's got its messages very mixed, and we're ricocheting around from the age of entitlement to buying a whole bunch of joint strike fighters to then the Commission of Audit.
Maybe we're entitled to have joint strike fighters.
Oh, I think we probably are entitled to some national defence, but there has been a lot of confusion about whether we're spending or whether we're cutting, and who's getting the tax cuts, and are there tax rises. So I don't think the government has handled its first budget particularly well leading in.
James, is it clear for you? I mean, there is, as Ben suggests, a lot of stuff going about, but there seems to be... I think that there's clarity about how bad it's going to be, given how much we've been primed to expect various other things which are bad and politically damaging. The other side of Tuesday night must be quite dramatic.
Yes, well, I think one thing to keep in mind when analysing the pre-budget media strategy is to remember that not every budget leak is actually a leak. Sometimes it's an accident, and one press gallery journalist reminded me this week that journalists aren't completely crap at their jobs, and occasionally they do come across a scoop. And I think that could possibly definitely be the case with the income tax hike, because the government's argument now is, look, stop getting so distracted and attracted by this income tax hike. When you see the picture of the full budget, no one's going to be talking about this small income tax hike. They're going to be talking about massive cuts. Now, if that is true, then they would have been much better for the income tax hike to be announced along with the cuts instead of dominating coverage for 2 weeks and being a broken promise.
Unless the tactic is, despite the broken promise, that we needed at least that sort of sense of camouflage and that idea of we're all in this together. That's
perhaps, but if they had planned it, if they had known what was coming, I don't think they would have planned the pain they've had over the last few weeks. I mean, people have been in uproar, and Bill Shorten's made great gains talking about broken promises. Let alone if they, the income tax side is bad enough, but let alone if they go ahead with a petrol excise increase, which is going to actually hit everyone and in a pretty substantial way.
Is the broken promise thing the worst of it, Ben, or is it just that it's a bit of rubbish policy?
No, I think the worst of it actually is the fact that ordinary Australians don't really want big cuts to public spending, and I think that's what's driving the poll figures downwards for the government. People have had a look at this Commission of Audit, and they've had a look at the rhetoric of slash and burn austerity, and I don't think they like it.
What do you think, Sinclair? I mean, is there a sense that the government is kind of believing its own story around the economy?
I actually think that what we're seeing is the politics and arrogance of power here, is that we had a government coming to office with a promise to cut spending, to get the budget in order and what have you, and on the promises there'd be no surprises and no tax increases. And they've broken that promise, or it looks to be that they will be breaking that promise. And this becomes another ETS moment when Mr. Rudd abandoned the ETS, and people are thinking, well, what did he stand for? And this is Abbott's problem. What does he stand for if he's going to break a tax promise, which is his whole reason for coming to power in the first place?
And it's worse than just undermining the credibility of a particular government. I mean, because of that accumulated
It
effect.
undermines politics, generally speaking. The story that I'm hearing from a lot of Conservatives, it's better that Tony Abbott breaks his promise in office than Bill Shorten gets to keep his promises in office. Now, that's an astonishingly cynical view of our political process, and I think a lot of people think and know that we are entitled, dreadful word, we are entitled to better than that.
We're entitled to, James, to I think, feel that sense of cynicism that Sinclair mentions.
One of the most extraordinary things about this fight over the income tax increase has been the number of Liberal backbenchers and ministers who've been happy to be quoted off the record in the newspapers. We haven't seen this sort of off-the-record briefing since Malcolm Turnbull was Liberal leader and during the emissions trading scheme debate. Now, that's pretty extraordinary to think, particularly because we're only just 6 months into a brand new government and Tony Abbott is not a weak opposition leader but a powerful Prime Minister.
And you mentioned that comparison. I mean, again, though, we have that issue on which the party divides, and there goes the discipline. I mean, we haven't had that sort of point of tension through the leadership of Tony Abbott to this point.
No, we haven't. But increasingly, Tony Abbott is making, what are termed captain's picks or leaders' calls, and there is a time at which I think patience for those will wear out. He made that on the paid parental leave scheme. He's doing it on this income tax increase. If he keeps doing things like this, and particularly if he chooses to do them in a way that really angers his own backbench and his own grassroots, that can't go on forever. That runs out at a point. The people's patience for that, there is a limit to it.
And people broadly, Ben, I think this is a really interesting point here, is just what we saw with Rudd, what we saw with Gillard, what we're now seeing with Abbott, and the sense that people have is that, damn it, none of you are to be trusted. That doesn't leave me voting necessarily for Clive Palmer, but it leaves me with a flash of empathy for the whole system.
Yeah, political capital can't really be hoarded. It has to be spent. And what's interesting about the sort of first 9 months of the Abbott government is how disorganised they've been in terms of carrying out their mandate. They haven't seemed to have had a unity of vision in terms of, right, we've been elected, this is what we're going to do. They've been all over the shop, and even things like knights and dames, that's an astonishing waste of political capital on a pretty trivial issue, particularly if it was a captain's pick, as James sort of says it was.
But doesn't this point, James, to sort of an error in that campaign, that it wasn't a campaign that said much about what the first-term agenda would be? It said, basically, first-term we're going to do nothing. We're going to talk about some stuff that we might actually try and get a mandate for a second-term agenda.
I don't think any political leader has ruled out as much as Tony Abbott did prior to the last election. And, figures in the government are saying, well, we're horribly hamstrung by what we said prior to the election. If we're going to deliver on our promise to get the budget, back into shape, we have to break one promise. So we have to pick the promise that we're going to break that's going to hurt us the least. And their judgment has been, that one of those promises is going to be tax increases. I'm not sure that's the right judgment, but in any case, it is a salutary lesson for politicians that don't be so. If you intend to actually do something when you get elected to power, don't be so clear about what you're not going to do prior to the election.
Yes, the pit has been dug. Outsiders this morning on Sunday Extra, 10 minutes away from 10 they are. James Patterson, you just heard, Ben Eltham and Sinclair Davidson. Sinclair, let's cast forward a bit. I mean, it's outside of the politics. What ought we see on Tuesday night?
I think we need to see a clear and articulate plan where the budget goes back into surplus. Now, if we cast our minds back to the global financial crisis, the previous government spent a lot of money and they announced at the same time a plan back to surplus. That plan failed. They've paid the price of it. They got flung out of office. And we now have to see the other mob putting together or articulating at least a plan to get back budget into surplus, debt down to manageable levels, and make sure that government isn't retarding economic prosperity going forward. Now, that's actually a hard job. Now, Wayne Swan gave it his best go and failed. And now we've got to see, can hockey step up to the plate? And certainly the vision that I'm seeing around hockey is not taking this as seriously perhaps as he could be, but Tuesday night is going to be the crunch time, and we will see on Tuesday night.
Do you agree, Ben, with that prescription?
No, I think Sinclair's wrong there. I think that the stimulus spending in 2009 was temporary, and that Labor had cut spending back to pretty low levels by the time that they left office. Everybody knows, you just have to look at the budget papers. The problem with the budget is revenue, it's not spending. The reason why the budget is in deficit is because revenue is at about 22% of GDP, whereas under John Howard it was at 25%. So if we're going to talk about getting the budget back into surplus, we probably do need to look at tax increases. I mean, I'm actually quite supportive of these ideas like indexing fuel excise and raising taxes on high-income earners. I'm surprised that this is a coalition government advocating for these policies, but I quite like them as a social democrat.
Isn't that exactly the problem that Mr. Abbott actually has? At some point he's going to have to realise he needs his own supporters more than they need him. And he doesn't need Labor voters, more or less, supporting him.
And we're still to come at a point in this cycle we mentioned before, James, of the two terms where we have the actual revenue discussion, which puts this budget in a strange kind of place. The government really hasn't framed their thinking around revenue yet, and if there's a good example of that, it's the debt tax.
Well, but prior to the last election, Tony Abbott said that we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. So in his own words, there is no revenue problem to address. And I think it actually is an important, serious point here about spending versus revenue. The so-called stimulus spending put through the GFC peaked at 26% of GDP at the middle of the GFC. Last year, the government, as a percentage of GDP, was 25.9% of GDP. So far from what Ben says that spending has been cut back, actually it's back basically where it was at the crisis point of the GFC. Revenue has dropped a little bit, but revenue has dropped less than than expenditure has increased by. And there's a whole lot of areas.
That's just not true.
Revenue is actually at its long-term average since 1971 to now. So revenue is its long-term average. Yes, Howard did have more revenue than normally, but revenue is back to its long-term average. Spending remains well above its long-term average. We have a spending problem, and Hockey needs to cut that spending and leave revenue alone like they promised dozens of times before the last election.
Ben?
Australia has the fourth lowest spending federal government in the OECD. I mean, we just don't have a spending problem.
That is just a bizarre point of comparison. You're putting Australia alongside France and Spain and Italy, who are other members of the OECD. The OECD is not a great point of comparison.
Plenty of other countries. There's 30 countries.
The other thing to bear in mind
OECD.
is we have a privatised superannuation system, which means you've got to strip out the socialised superannuation system in Europe and comparing to us. OECD comparisons tend to be very, very biased and very, very misleading, which is why big spenders like to make that comparison.
And there we have the dilemma in a three-way nutshell. Some way or other will be resolved on Tuesday night, thanks to Sinclair Davidson, Ben Eltham and James Patterson. They have been your outsiders this morning.
Welcome to First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living. I'm Walkley Award-winning cartoonist for The Guardian, First Dog on the Moon. And this week, the nation's been preparing for the federal budget. Tinned food and bottled water are in short supply, and the same for axes and kerosene. Doors and windows are being boarded up across the country, and an ominous silence has descended upon the empty streets and highways. Stay in your homes, don't answer the door, leave the lights off. Of course, it's different in Canberra on Capitol Hill. All the lights are on around the clock. Everyone is very busy and very important, burning the midnight oil, stoking the great belching engines in the bowels of the Treasury, scrutinising the endless lists, and an army of accountants adding and subtracting column after column of numbers in journal after journal with their ink-stained fingers, counting and reckoning and collating the specific details of who is going to cop it up the fiscal sphincter and how far up it will go. Obviously, we have to wait until Tuesday night to find out exactly what and how far, but here's a hint. If you can afford a bunch of tax lawyers to sort out your taxes for you, not much will change. For everyone else, if you've put aside any Nembutal for a rainy day, now might be the time. There's not going to be much left of the nation by the end of the week. You see, on Budget Day, everyone will be very busy delivering the bad news to the nation. Oh, except, of course, for our cigar-smoking treasurer, Joe, over my dead body Hockey. He'll be having an exclusive fancy lunch in North Sydney, And it will only cost you $4,000 to get along. All proceeds go to the... let me check. Hang on. Oh, it's the Liberal Party. But don't worry, you don't have to pay to have access to ministers. It's just fundraising, and they all do it. The ALP do it. They just can't charge as much because nobody even knows who the leader of the opposition is. I know I don't. There is, of course, no suggestion that people are paying for access or influence to anyone in the federal government. This isn't New South Wales. It's all perfectly legal and above board. You can make a donation to the party while having a chat and a pikelet with your favourite member of cabinet. And here at the Guide to Modern Living, we've been lucky enough to obtain a copy of the price guidelines which the federal Liberal Party use. And right at the top is Tony himself. For only $10,000 you get a half hour in the Prime Ministerial sauna and a good going over with a posy of birch branches. So Scandinavian, you won't be mincing your words after this. Lunch with the Treasurer will set you back $4,000. And for another $2,000, you get a copy of his latest PowerPoint presentation, Wind Turbines, Entitlement and Other Things I Am Offended By. It's $3,000 to attend George Brandis's book club, BYO Book. Oh, and please make sure it's on the government's approved reading list, which is secret, so do be careful of that one. Get your freak on with Greg Hunt. This is a colourful 20 minutes letting it all hang loose with the Environment Minister. You'll come away with a first-hand understanding of direct action. That's $1,500. And, oh, this one sounds fun. How to crochet a merkin with the Minister for Education. A steal at $2,500. You can get a foot rub from Warren Truss for $11.50. And half an hour with Kevin Andrews for $1,000. 15 minutes with Kevin Andrews for $2,000. And not seeing Kevin Andrews at all is $5,000. So there's a real bargain there. Watching Scott Morrison pull the wings off flies while sitting in a bathtub full of custard for 15 minutes will cost you $2,000, but it's cheaper to just watch his press conferences and the effect is the same. Oh, and this is nice. Ian McFarlane, the Minister for Industry, sings the hits of Tom Waits with Bronwyn Bishop on the double bass. Now that's only $1,100, and right now, as a special treat, we're going to have a small sample of what you can expect to hear. Hey listeners, let's do lunch sometime. This has been First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living. Ka-ching! Ian McFarlane and Bronwyn Bishop.
Well, there you go. We all await Joe Crocker Shit Hockey's first budget, where he makes Tony Abbott into the biggest liar we've ever had as Prime Muppet. Nobody has any idea where Australia's going to go into the future. I think they're talking 25 or 27,000 federal government public servant jobs to be axed, so unemployment will be up. But they're talking about limiting the amount of time that people can stay on the dole and making people wait for half a year before they can get the dole, especially if they're young people. The government of Australia really, really, really does not like young people. This is because in the last 1,000 years on planet Earth, 80% of all environmental damage has been done by people who were born between 1880 and 1980. Those are the people who've done the damage to the environment. That's why the economy won't run, because you can't have any economic activity unless there's an environmental surplus. And the cohort, the century of people who were born from 1880 to 1980 have destroyed the environment, destroyed the biosphere, destabilised the planet's homeostasis mechanisms. So therefore, it's obvious the solution is to make sure that school leavers don't get the dole for 6 months. And then if they've been on the dole for 6 months and they haven't found a job, well, obvious, just make them move. Pull up stakes, cut all ties with family and friends and known localities and old favours, and shift somewhere where they're completely anonymous so that when they fall on hard times, they won't have any qualms with turning to crime and robbing strangers. Because once they start robbing strangers and raising the crime rates, why, then Matthias Kemp, who only sounds like he's a white South African, he only sounds like he's a white South African because he's got a Belgian accent. He's a proper, actual Belgian, not a Flemish Afrikaner. I would remind you that in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the word Belgium was a swear word. Well, Matthias Kemp comes from Belgium. He's a fucking swear word on legs, that bloke, the Minister for Finance. He'll be back. He'll be back after the budget, advocating for more law and more order and more security guards and more prison guards to lock up the wicked, evil, crime wave of youngsters turning to nefarious activities because Australia doesn't want to pay them the dole anymore. Australia wants to starve them into creating a job. The Liberal Party doesn't want business to create jobs. It wants to free up the process for terminating workers' employment. The Liberal Party wants to cut the Australian basic minimum wage from $630 a week to $430 a week so that nobody's got any money to buy any of the fuel at the new increased excise tax rate. Nobody will have any money to pay any GST on any consumer goods because they won't have any wages, because they either won't have a job or their wages will be cut. It's because the program and the policy of the Liberal government is to import third world conditions to Australia so that their mates in big business can be happy, the people who paid into the 5x8 fund, so that the Liberal Party in New South Wales, where does Tony Abbott have his seat? Oh yes, Sydney, Wahroonga. Isn't that right, North Shore? He's a Hornsby fruitcake. After the budget, life's going to get tough. But because the Liberal National Government likes to be nice to old people, so they say, the first people to get hit will be disability support pensioners under the age of 35. So it sounds like I may have just dodged their laser-guided gunfire yet again. Who knows? They're going to unravel the structure and the fabric of Australian society. They want to deregulate university fees so that none but the rich can afford to have their children educated. They want to get rid of the idea that Australians can go to the doctor and be treated for whatever ails them for free, because an economic lobbyist has decided that if you divide the number of doctors' visits by the number of people in Australia, then the average Australian is hypothetically visiting the doctor 11 times per year. And he doesn't think Australians are that crook. So the fact that he hasn't been to the doctor for probably 4 or 5 years, since last time he got somebody to finger his arse and massage his prostate, then nobody should go to the doctor any more than he does. The idea that somebody might actually have something wrong with them and need to go to the doctor 2 or 3 times a week, that hasn't registered on the economic, dry, neo-conservative, liberal mindset. So no dole, no disability support pensions. Old age pension age is going to rise to 70. No free hospitals, no free education. But we're going to have $24 billion worth of F-35 Joint Strike Fighters. The vertical takeoff and landing supersonic stealth fighter that basically is turning out to be a horse designed by a committee which looks like a camel with a whale tail. It can actually bend the arse of its jet engine through 90 degrees down and 35 degrees left or right. And then we've got to have 12 submarines so that we can help America lose a war when it decides to fight with China over who's got the fastest shrinking economy. Yeah, great. Why is it so? Why do Australians vote for such half-witted, greedy, transparent, shallow arseholes? I think it's because during the election process the greedy, shallow, transparent arseholes compete to tell lies about how tunefully they will play upon the horn of plenty and what colours and flavours of milk and honey they will cause it to issue forth. And then as soon as they get into politics and get into office, they commence to line their own pockets, to feather the nests of their friends, so that when they leave politics, they'll get a rich, fat, cushy job as a lobbyist to pervert and corrupt the next generation who go to sit in the seats of power. Warbles on what to YouTube. Sorry for the gravelly voice, but I didn't get home till 4 o'clock in the morning last night. I were at the 22nd annual Stockwood Music Festival on the local alternative lifestyle community. I have 4 or 5 clips that I shot down there in night camera mode. I think there's one of them that I forgot to engage night camera mode, so it's got better definition but lots more dark areas. I'll upload those later. At the moment I'm going to have coffee and slowly come back up to speed with having my eyes open during the day. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.